My childhood home was surrounded by tall oleander hedges on 3 sides. They ran along the inside and outside of the fence of our backyard and seemed to have been planted for privacy reasons. They had been there since we moved in. Because we lived on the outer edge of our cul-de-sac, the southern side of these hedges abutted the sidewalk of the main street by our house. The hedges were thick enough that the outer hedges were popular hiding spots for other kids in our neighborhood. I was fine with hiding in them during the day, but at night, I would not even walk down the sidewalk without passing to the opposite side of the street. It hadn't always been this way, though. I had walked by them many times after dark on the way home from a friend's house, or playing with some of my neighbors at night, despite the fact that they were in a gap between streetlights. The darkness that clung to them terrified me, but that had never stopped me before. One night when I was 9, however, as I came up to the edge of the oleanders, I felt a moment of absolute terror. Something deep inside me was screaming at me to avoid the bushes ahead. Admittedly, I had experienced similar episodes of fear before, but this time felt different. I stopped walking, and as the sound of my footsteps on the concrete faded, the only thing I could hear was the frenetic tempo of my heart. Then, I heard another sound. Have you ever heard a song at such low volume that it is unrecognizable at first? The notes graze the edges of your hearing, and your brain strains to identify something familiar. Then, all in a rush, you realize what song it is, and despite the fact that you can still not hear some of the notes, your brain fills them in, and you feel relieved that you have been able to decipher what escaped you at first. I had a similar moment of confusion, then realization. Was that the wind in the leaves? A cat rustling through the branches? The next moment, I recognized it. I couldn't hear it well, but what I could hear meshed with the sudden image in my head, and I could feel myself slowly stepping backwards, eyes still on the bushes. I remembered a hospital visit. I remembered my grandmother, sleeping in a way that seemed peaceful. Her breathing sounded anything but peaceful, however. It rasped, with agonizing slowness in and out. The strain of it seemed strong enough to tear the delicate tissue of her throat, as it was forced into and out of her lungs. I'd never heard someone breathe like that before, and had not since, until that night. That rasping was the sound I heard as I retreated down the sidewalk. It was almost imperceptible among the other sounds of the night, but I could hear its highest notes, and my brain filled in the rest of the tune. It was at this moment I also noted an odd light patch in the uniform shadow of the bush ahead. It looked like a branch had been stripped of all its leaves and was hanging down over the sidewalk, about 5 feet off the ground. I had just walked past this hedge earlier, however, and none of the branches had hung over the sidewalk then. I immediately turned left and crossed the street, deciding that I would approach my house from the other side of the cul-de-sac. I lost view of the hedge for a few moments when my back was turned, but soon I was on the other side of the road. I watched the bushes from across the street as I passed them. They swayed slightly, tall and imposing, the walls of a dark fortress. I realized with a small shock that the branch that I had seen earlier was gone. There was no interruption in the uniform blackness of the hedge. I quickened my pace as my imagination conjured a choice selection of horrifying creatures that could be watching from the darkness. I finally crossed back to the other side of the street after I had gotten level with the side of the cul-de-sac across the street from my house. I approached my house directly from the front, straight up to the front door, but I kept my eyes on the darkness that groped at the periphery of that safe place. I could swear I heard the slapping of bare feet on concrete somewhere off to my right, and I quickened my pace. When I reached the door, I scrambled inside and quickly locked it behind me. I sat down then, just inside the threshold, and breathed. None of my family were within sight. I could hear them in the kitchen off to my left. I spent a good 5 minutes sitting there, and when I went further in to join my family, I did not tell them about my experience. Since I know that might bring up questions, let me explain. I used to go to my parents whenever I was scared, and that was a lot of the time. When I was younger, they humored and comforted me, but as I got a bit older, they got progressively less patient. I learned not to bring them stories about the pale fingers curling around the edge of the fireplace as I passed it in the dark. I learned not to tell them about the creaking of the roof above my bedroom, or the whispers I swore I heard as I lay in bed or played video games in our living room late at night. I once laid in bed for an hour with an odd tapping sounding at my window, sure that a murderer was standing outside. And when I finally had the courage to get out of bed to run for my parents, I saw it was only a cat, inadvertently tapping the glass as it licked at its paws. My parents only shook their heads when I told them. In short, I knew that the story would be dismissed as a product of my active imagination, and would likely result in a lecture about the difference between reality and fiction. Plus, I couldn't even be sure what I had experienced was real. So, when my mom noticed my shaken state and asked what had scared me this time, I brushed her curiosity off. She gently told me that I should start coming home before dark. I couldn't help but agree. After I had finished my dinner, I went to go find my dad. He had already finished eating and was working on his car in the garage. My dad loved to tinker and jerry-rig. For example, our roof had small windows over the living room where the two portions of our roof met. They were set vertically, filling the space between the higher half of the roof and the lower half. They were basically a row of 1 foot by 3 foot windows that ran along the course of the room at ceiling level. My mom loved those windows and the light they provided, but then one broke in a particularly violent hailstorm. My dad was about to board the window up because we didn't have a lot of money at the time to replace it, but my mom begged him to find another solution. He had instead put a spare screen over the window, and I constructed a small box with scrap wood to put around it on the roof. He put a little door on the box, so that we could still leave it open to the outside when the weather was agreeable. Thus, when I entered the garage, it was filled with a large assortment of similar projects and repairs that he was in the process of working on. Lit from below by 2 floodlights, my dad had set up to help him see the underside of the car. He was laying on his back underneath it, and he was not aware that I had entered. I stood in the doorway for a while trying to work up the courage to tell him about what had happened, but after envisioning a few responses, I slipped back inside without a word. That night, as I played video games after my parents and brother had gone to bed, my eyes were continuously drawn towards the window that looked into my backyard. I could see the oleanders moving slightly. I kept telling myself that the wind was responsible for their rocking and swaying, but I couldn't help imagining that there was something crawling through them, staring at me in the low light from the TV screen. I didn't sleep that night until the sun had started to rise. After that night, things returned to relative normalcy. I experienced frightening oddities quite a bit more frequently after my parents went to bed, however. During the weekends or summer vacation, I frequently played video games for a few hours by myself after the rest of my family had gone to bed. I started hearing footsteps on the roof above me during those times, and I would suddenly hear faint whispers at moments when I was sure that I was the only one awake. I rationalized it by telling myself that my normal routine just reminded me of that night when I was frightened, and this made my imagination run wild. Things stayed pretty quiet though, until, that is, we found the dead dog. A couple of months after my first encounter, I was playing hide and seek with my neighborhood friends. Since that night, I tended to avoid my hedges as a hiding spot, but my friends loved to hide in them. Knowing this, I decided to run into the oleanders when it was my turn to be it. It was during the day, and I was surrounded by friends. What could go wrong? I dove in through one section where the branches were not as thick. It was difficult to get around in there without knowing your way, but me and my friends had been playing in these bushes for years. It was kind of dark, but as my eyes adjusted to the lower light, it was easy to see my friend, Tim, trying to escape my notice through the leaves to my left. I ran after him, my arms reaching, as he shot away from me with a yelp. The going was a bit slow in there, which is probably the only reason why I did not bowl Tim over when he suddenly stopped. I slapped my hand into his back. "You're it!" I called out, turning to run the way I had come. I looked back after a couple of steps. Tim hadn't moved. I walked over to him and said, "Tim? What's up?" I looked over his shoulder. On the ground in front of us, nestled among the branches, was about half of my friend Casey's dog. Naturally, the game was halted. Casey ran home to tell his parents, tears in his eyes. The rest of us examined the corpse. Most of the back half of the dog was missing. It still had a head and the 2 front legs, but a large portion of the body had been ripped away. There were a few scattered bones and bits of fur around the area. I felt a chill when one of my friends suggested that something had been eating it. After my parents heard about the incident, they comforted me by staying up late with me, watching movies. They knew what I had seen had affected me greatly, but I don't think they knew that the main emotion I was feeling was fear. Something was living in the hedges around my house, or at least using them occasionally. I was sure of it. It had caught my friend's dog, and it had been trying to catch me. I shuddered every time I thought about it. My parents eventually ushered me off to bed. I barely slept. When I woke up the next morning, I decided that I had to tell my parents what had happened to me, and what I suspected had happened to the dog. I approached my mom while she was cooking breakfast. I tugged on her robe and said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." "What is it, sweetie?" she asked, now taking her eyes off the eggs she was frying. "I think something ate Casey's dog and—" "Oh yes, it's awful," she interrupted, still keeping her eyes on her cooking. "The HOA sent out a notice this morning. There must be a coyote loose in the neighborhood. People are supposed to keep all of their pets inside at night." "I don't think it was a coyote, Mom," I said, trying to steel myself for what I was about to tell her. "What else would it be?" "Oh, honey." She had finally looked at me, her eyes welling with emotion, her mouth turning down slightly at the ends. "You were up all night worrying about this, weren't you?" "Yes, Mom, but that's because—" "Honey," she said, grabbing me by the shoulders, her voice growing more firm. "You need to learn to live in reality. There are no such things as monsters. No matter what you saw, you need to stop doing this to yourself. Look at you." She clucked her tongue and turned to load a plate with bacon and eggs. "We're getting some food in you, and you're going to lay down for a few hours until those bags under your eyes shrink down." There was no protesting. She had deflated my arguments before I even made them, which, to be fair, was likely the result of her dealing with similar claims from me so often. I let her guide me to the table. She quickly whisked another plate out to the garage where my dad was presumably working on some of his projects, since it was Saturday morning. I continued eating, sure that my chance at trying to convince my dad was being sabotaged by my mom's good intentions. Sure enough, he soon followed her into the kitchen and gave me a look, his eyebrows furrowed, his jaw set. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, I said, "It's fine. Mom already said everything you're thinking of saying." He closed his mouth, pursed his lips, shrugged, and went back out into the garage. After breakfast, my mom guided me over to the couch in the living room and ordered me to lay down and go back to sleep. Though I was definitely tired enough to do so, sleep was not quick in coming. I stared up at the ceiling, noticing the lack of light coming from one of the windows above my head, and wondering why the little box outside of it was closed today, as it seemed like the weather was perfect outside. Soon, I was sitting up and playing some Wind Waker on the GameCube, staring across the room at the TV near the opposite wall. When my little brother wandered into the room sometime later, he asked, "Can I play too?" "This is a one-player game, Jimmy," I answered, then sighed and popped in Smash Bros. Instead. Eventually, late in the afternoon, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the house was dark, aside from some ambient light filtering in through the windows, and completely silent. The pillow behind my head and the way my arms were tucked into the blanket on top of me told me that my mom had decided to avoid moving me to my bed when I had fallen asleep. I closed my eyes again. I was about to drift off when I heard it. Low, almost imperceptible raspy breathing. I wouldn't have been able to hear it if the room wasn't so quiet. My eyes snapped open, but I didn't move another muscle as I strained to focus, trying to hear where it was coming from. This continued what could have been minutes or hours. The passage of time was impossible to gauge when my mind was full of visions of nightmare creatures and the horrible way they would sink their teeth into my flesh. After a while, I heard a creaking sound from above me. The light on the ceiling increased in the vicinity of the window that had broken. Then, a series of quieter creaks traveled across the ceiling, and the sound of the breathing faded. I jumped up off the couch and ran into my room as quickly as I could. I made sure the window was locked, and I locked the door as well. Whatever I had seen, whatever had eaten Casey's dog, had squeezed itself into the box my father had built, and had been resting straight above me. I shuddered as I remembered all the odd noises I had heard while playing video games alone at night. It had never been as completely silent on those nights as it was this night. The breathing could have been there all along, and I would not have noticed it. I clutched my hands to my ears as I imagined how many times it had watched me from above without my knowledge.